Welcome to table for 92, element number 71, lutetium. It's number 71 because it has exactly 71 protons within its nucleus. For lutetium, we're cooking up some of the greatest Parisian street food for Georges Urbain of Paris. He discovered lutetium and named it lutetium after the old Latin word for what is now Paris, Lutetia parisorum, or Lutetia of the Parisi, the name of the Gallic tribe that lived in the area at the time the Romans took over like 2,000 years ago. This is the last of the lanthanide elements, also known as the rare earth elements, and also known as the group of elements that almost broke my brain because it is incredibly frustrating to understand them. Seriously, the history of how they were all discovered, the confusion in which they were categorized, and the constant reorganization of the elements have been extremely frustrating. But they are also absolutely fascinating. And without some of them, you wouldn't have a smartphone to be watching this episode. So without what we have now discovered the rare earths can do in technology, without that, we'd still be living life like they were in the 1950s, really. So really technological leaps have come out of this stuff. Just to recap a bit, first of all, none of the lanthanides are directly found in foods, at least not naturally. It's not like calcium or iron or anything. The lanthanide elements, they're all silvery metals when in a pure state, but they aren't found in a pure state in nature. But through many painstaking centuries, chemists have figured out how to free them from their chemical bonds and the minerals they're found in. So anyway, I decided to cook for lutetium a jambon beurre. It's a ham and butter sandwich. It's delicious. It's what you get on the streets of Paris. I'm gonna be making this butter fresh for it because to me, the butter is the unsung hero of the jambon beurre. It literally means like ham butter. So, ham butter sandwich. I've made my own baguettes before, and if you want to learn, I highly recommend you read this book, In Search of the Perfect Loaf by Samuel Fromartz. He's a journalist that spent a lot of time in France and later won awards for his own baguettes that he cooked and won that award against French people. So, it's a good book. So I found jambon de Paris. It's the wet cured ham that's used in the traditional ham butter sandwiches. It's not that expensive. Like I got it at the store. It's basically like the best Lunchables ham you've ever had. I know younger people don't really have Lunchables anymore, but like when I was growing up, a lot of kids had it. And it was like basically just like ham and cheese and crackers and a little thing. And it was just terrible for you. So they kind of took it off the shelves, but now it's making a big resurgence apparently. But yeah, people have written articles that Lunchables actually taught the millennial generation about charcuterie boards because it was like this nice little assortment. That's why we all like our charcuterie boards. But yeah, this is like the best wet cured ham you can get. Jambon Paris. Yeah. Delicious. So like making butter is really not that hard, and like I don't say this to be cruel or anything, but like most people don't know how to make butter. Like maybe they know there's like a churn or something involved. Like I have this little hand-powered churner. It'll make butter out of heavy cream in 8 minutes, but I've heard archaeologists use making butter as an analogy to how easy cultural knowledge can be lost, right? Very few people today know how to make butter because very few people today live on farms. Like as the US Farm Bureau says, it's like 2% of Americans like live full-time like on farms today. 100 years ago, it was like 40%. So in just a few generations, you have this huge demographic shift from farms to cities and suburbs. And so yeah, like you can see how something as simple as making butter, that knowledge can just disappear. And this happens all throughout history. It's just a neat little example. But yeah, making butter is easy. I think it's done. So the ice water, you put the butter in there, and that's gonna help separate out the rest of the buttermilk, and it's not gonna like melt in your hands while you're doing it. If you use store-bought heavy cream, the butter will come out like pretty much white, not that beautiful like yellow color you're looking for. So yeah, this is in large part, it's the feed. It's what the dairy cows are eating. And the breed of the cattle, being used, that's part of it too. Actually, in some places, like they actually use yellow dye to make it look fancier. Like, the big reason though, it's beta carotene. That's found in wildflowers and grasses, and that has way more than it just does in corn. So a dairy cow that's out grazing on wildflowers and grasses, it's gonna have more beta carotene stored in the milk than, like a dairy cow that's getting fed corn. for example. But the beta carotene is protected by the membrane in the milk. So by churning or using a food mixer, you're breaking the membrane and releasing beta carotene. That's in the fat of the milk. So among like the milks and the creams and stuff, you got skim milk, 1%, 2%. Whole milk, that's 3% fat. Heavy cream is about 35% fat, where butter is like concentration of about 80% fat. That's why butter is so good. It's basically fat. It's delicious, right? Lutetium, named after Paris. French cuisine is a lot of things, but it wouldn't be anything without butter, right? I mean, butter's kind of the center of it. I mean, you ask the question, why does food taste better at restaurants than at home? Butter, that's why. They like just put way more butter in foods at restaurants than you ever would think to at home. The first cooking jobs I got, it was kind of horrifying. Like I worked in a steakhouse where we made this steak sauce, and the family would make like these 5-gallon buckets of the steak sauce, and we weren't allowed to see because it was a secret recipe, right? But they'd have it in the walk-in freezer, and it was like, you know, like a 5-gallon bucket, and the butter would separate in this steak sauce away from all the other ingredients. No joke, there'd be like a 6-inch layer of fat on the top of that steak sauce. It was just butter. People were always like, oh, is it like the bourbon in the steak sauce or like the molasses? No, it's butter. Like that's why their steak sauce was so good. It was just butter.
All my favorite foods have butter on them. Pancakes, toast, popcorn, grapes. Butter is my favorite food.
Thank you, Andy. Okay, so the lanthanide elements and the rare earth elements aren't the exact same thing. The lanthanide elements are the elements from 57 to 71 on the periodic table. The rare earth elements are all the lanthanide elements plus scandium and yttrium, all in row 3 of the periodic table. You know, they're table buddies, as I like to call them. And the rare earth elements aren't actually that rare. It's just that they are extremely difficult to extract from the minerals they're found in. And on top of that, the lanthanides are all very similar. You know, that's why they're all together in the little box. It makes it so difficult, and especially for these early chemists, to differentiate between them. Plus, oftentimes they're found within minerals joined with radioactive elements like thorium or uranium, and so the extraction of rare earth elements is dangerous and expensive and super bad for the local environments if not done responsibly. That's why we stopped doing it in the US and let China do it starting in like the 70s and 80s. Now, China has a monopoly on rare earth elements, and you know, but for that reason and all the stuff that goes into it, it's why there's no more river dolphins in China. So like, was it worth it to own all the rare earth elements and completely destroy your own environment? I don't know. They seem to be enjoying the rare earth elements they have though. But here's the really interesting thing about the rare earth elements, at least to me. When they were all discovered over about a 100-year span from the late 1700s into the early 1900s, they had no real use in technology. Like it wasn't until the 1960s these rare earth elements were, put into anything. Before that, they were just curiosities, and they weren't really known outside of like hardcore physicists and chemists, As you probably know, the rare earth elements are arguably the most important elements to modern technology and have helped us, for better or worse, to create, our modern society. Weirdly enough, lutetium, being the last of the lanthanide elements, was also the last of the rare earth / lanthanide elements to be discovered. Remember when I said the history of these elements being discovered is extremely frustrating? Yeah, lutetium really wraps it all up quite nicely. I hope you've watched the other episodes about the lanthanide elements, and before that, scandium and yttrium. There are some great Swedish recipes in there. But if you haven't, the lanthanide elements are so incredibly similar. Again, that's why they've got their own little club on the bottom of the periodic table. Okay, so it really starts in 1794 when yttrium is first discovered as an element. Then later on in 1843, they discover that yttrium is actually 3 elements. You can basically think of all of this like a Russian nesting doll, right? Like you remove one and there's another one inside, another one inside, another one inside. This happens with these rare earth elements over like a 100-year period. So yttrium is actually yttrium, erbium, and terbium. A few years later, as you can see the cross here, they figure out that the original erbium and terbium was incorrect, so they were switched. Erbium becomes terbium, terbium becomes erbium. Gets the old Uno reverse card. Boom. They later find, though, that terbium is not just terbium, but also has gadolinium hiding inside of it. So terbium becomes 2 elements. Same thing happens with erbium, except even more. So at first it's discovered that erbium has erbium, thulium, holmium inside. Later on they find out that holmium has holmium and dysprosium inside. Then after that they find that there is ytterbium inside of erbium. And then scandium is inside of ytterbium, and that ytterbium is also got lutetium in it. So that's how we eventually get lutetium, from 1794 to lutetium in 1907. But yeah, this is the chart of how it goes, right? And then the same thing happens with cerium on the other side of the rare earth elements. And then on top of that, you have promethium at the very bottom. But you talk about rare earth elements, we believe there's only about 500 grams of promethium in all of Earth's crust. It's extremely radioactive, so most of it is just degraded away. Enter Georges Urbain. My God, what a handsome man. Look at that beard. Look at that pipe. He seems like he would have been a good time. So, Urbain worked in the early 1900s, working mostly with the rare earth elements, and in 1907 figured out a process to separate ytterbium and this other unknown element. But Georges Urbain was actually the second guy to discover lutetium. Karl Auer von Felsbach, an Austrian, he discovered it first working with a sample of ytterbium, but that didn't matter. Georges Urbain found it later, but had it published first. Doesn't matter who found it first, matters who published it first. This happens all the time in all different kinds of sciences. In dinosaurs, this has happened all over. Basically, every great scientific discovery, there's almost always like some back and forth over who actually discovered it and who actually published it first, but it's really who publishes it first. But hey, look, lutetium is rarely used outside of research. It is the conclusion of the lanthanide elements, and dare I say, the most boring I have yet to have come across. But honestly, it's not used now. I guarantee you, one day, some chemist, some physicist will find a use for it, maybe in MRI scanning or super strong magnets or the next atomic clock. That's a possibility. And you know, after all, this discovery took place in 1794, and it was like over 150 years from when they were discovered until they actually found some uses for them outside of a laboratory. And yeah, now them things are in everything. So, you know, science marches forward. We'll find a use for it. Salt your butter as much as you want. Put the ham on. Okay, so in France, the jambon beurre is probably more like this side, but this is America, so yeah, delicious. Butter and ham on bread. That's all you need. Thank you. See you next time.